That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The silence in his small apartment was unbearable. Every sound that echoed off the walls reminded him Bailey wasn't there. He kept glancing at the corner where her bed used to be, half expecting her to yawn and curl into her usual circle. But it was empty. He walked over, slowly knelt, and picked up one of her old toys, a faded rubber bone that still smelled like her. He held it in his hands for a long time. The next morning, he didn't eat. He sat on the couch, staring out the window, watching the neighborhood children play. Bailey loved watching them too, tail wagging every time a ball bounced across the sidewalk. But now even the sound of laughter made Ethan ache. It wasn't just loneliness, it was guilt. He blamed himself for everything. Emily returned later that afternoon with updates. She was carrying a folder full of paperwork and had a hopeful look on her face. "I spoke to the judge's clerk," she said, sitting down. "They've agreed to hear your request at the hearing. No promises yet, but it's progress." Ethan blinked slowly. "So, I might get to see her again?" She nodded. "It's not guaranteed, but I made it clear, this isn't just a dog to you." I explained, "Bailey is registered as a certified emotional support animal. I even showed them your military medical evaluations. You have a right to be heard." He looked away for a moment, fighting back emotion. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know what I'd do without your help." "You don't have to thank me," she said softly. "I meant what I said. You served this country. The least we can do is try to serve you now." As the court date approached, Ethan prepared himself mentally. He didn't care about clearing his name as much as he cared about one thing: seeing Bailey again, if it meant never owning another dog, never visiting another park, never having another companion. He would accept it. But he needed to see her one last time. He needed to look her in the eyes and let her know he hadn't abandoned her. On the day of the hearing, he dressed in the only suit he owned, one he hadn't worn since his friend's funeral 2 years ago. The cuffs were tight, the jacket stiff, but he wore it with quiet dignity. Emily met him outside the courthouse, holding a folder and a cup of coffee for him. He didn't drink it. Inside, the courtroom was modest. There were maybe a dozen people present, a few observers, a couple of reporters, and the courtroom staff. Ethan didn't recognize any of them. He kept his head low as they waited for the judge. When the bailiff finally announced the case, Ethan stood up, his hands trembling at his sides. Emily stepped forward first, speaking with calm professionalism. She introduced the case, outlined Ethan's service history, and spoke about the circumstances of the incident at the store. Then she paused and turned slightly toward Ethan. "Your Honor," she said, "before we go any further, my client has a simple, personal request. One that I believe deserves to be heard, in his own words." The judge, a stern-looking man with gray hair and a heavy gaze, leaned back in his chair. "Proceed." Ethan stepped forward slowly. His voice cracked on the first few words, but he didn't stop. "I'm not here to make excuses for what happened," he said. "I've seen more than most people ever should, and I've done things I'll never forget. But Bailey, she's been the only thing that's helped me feel whole again. When I was at my lowest, when the nightmares wouldn't stop, when I couldn't breathe, she was there." The room was quiet now. Even the courtroom clock ticking felt loud. "I understand the charges. I understand the process. But if I lose her, it won't just hurt. It will break something in me that may not heal again. I'm not asking you to drop everything. I'm just asking for one last moment with her. One goodbye, please." The judge didn't speak right away. He studied Ethan for a long time. Then he said, "I'll consider it." Court is adjourned until the afternoon. As the gavel fell, Ethan felt both dread and hope pressing on his chest at once. He had laid his heart bare. Now all he could do was wait. Ethan waited outside the courtroom as the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the concrete. His hands were clenched in his lap, and his thoughts refused to settle. Emily sat beside him on the bench, reviewing her notes, but her eyes kept flicking over to him. She could see the storm inside him, even though he said nothing. Finally, the courtroom door opened again. The bailiff called them back in. Ethan stood, took a breath, and walked with steady steps. As they entered, the judge was already seated, papers arranged neatly in front of him. His expression was unreadable. "The court has reviewed the request," the judge began. "While this matter is still pending formal judgment, we will allow a supervised visit between Mr. Cole and his dog. This is to take place on courthouse property, under the observation of court officers and animal control." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He blinked, almost unsure if he had heard correctly. "You'll get your moment, Mr. Cole," the judge added, his voice slightly softer now. "Make it count." Ethan nodded slowly, unable to speak. The courtroom was still silent, but the energy had changed. Even the observers seemed to sit up straighter. Moved by what they were witnessing, animal control had already been contacted, and the dog was on her way. Ethan was escorted outside to a gated courtyard behind the building. A few benches stood around the edge, and trees cast soft shadows on the pavement. It wasn't much, but to Ethan, it was perfect. It was open sky. It was real ground. It was the place where he would finally see Bailey again. He stood near the far wall, eyes scanning the gated entrance, waiting. Then, a familiar bark echoed across the courtyard. His heart leaped. The gate opened slowly, and there she was, golden fur shining in the sunlight, ears perked, tail wagging wildly. Bailey. She didn't wait for a command. As soon as the leash loosened, she dashed forward. "Bailey." Ethan choked out, falling to his knees. Bailey lunged into his arms, whining and licking his face. Her entire body trembled with joy as she pressed against him, tail thumping the pavement. Ethan buried his face in her fur, gripping her tightly as his shoulders shook. "I'm here," he whispered, over and over. "I didn't leave you. I'm here." The officers standing nearby looked away, giving the moment quiet respect. Even the animal control handler wiped a tear from his cheek. Bailey kept licking his hands, nudging her head under his arm as if trying to make sure he was real. She winced softly and whimpered like she hadn't made a sound since the day they were separated. Ethan sat on the ground with her, holding her head gently between his hands, staring into her eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have protected you better. I should have fought harder. But I'm not done fighting." Emily watched from the edge of the courtyard, her arms folded, eyes misty. She knew this was more than just a reunion. It was a lifeline being restored. The man who had been barely functioning for weeks suddenly looked whole again. The visit lasted only 10 minutes, but to Ethan, time seemed to stretch and slow. Every second mattered. Every glance, every tail wag, every sigh from Bailey meant something. When the time was up, the officer stepped forward gently. "We need to take her now." Ethan didn't argue. He pressed his forehead to Bailey's for a moment longer, then slowly stood up. "She's all I've got," he said softly. "Please take care of her." As they walked her back through the gate, Bailey kept turning her head, eyes locked on Ethan. He stood there long after the gate closed, watching, refusing to look away until she was gone from sight. Emily walked up beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "That," she said quietly, "was more powerful than anything I could say in court." Ethan nodded, wiping his eyes. He wasn't giving up. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next day, the courtroom felt different. Everyone who had witnessed Ethan and Bailey's reunion couldn't quite shake the moment from their minds. People who had come expecting a routine hearing now returned out of curiosity, empathy, or something deeper. Word had spread. The story of the ex-soldier and his dog had made its way through town, then online. Reporters showed up with cameras, and veterans from nearby towns quietly filled the back rows. Ethan stood near the defense table, more composed now, but no less determined. Emily had spent the night preparing her arguments, but she knew one thing for certain: no piece of paper she held could speak louder than what the courtroom had already seen. When the judge entered, the room rose to their feet. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at Ethan. "Mr. Cole," he said, "we've reviewed the incident, your records, and the statements. There's more here than a minor disturbance." Ethan nodded. He knew that much, but there's also more than guilt or innocence. The judge continued. "There's a story unfolding here that this court can't ignore." Emily stepped forward. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to present additional testimony and evidence regarding Mr. Cole's condition, as well as Bailey's role as his support animal." "Proceed," the judge said. She began calmly, but with passion. She described Ethan's years of service, his medical diagnoses, and the VA reports documenting his trauma. She explained how Bailey was prescribed by a military therapist, certified as an emotional support animal, and had been with Ethan during the hardest chapters of his life. "She is not a pet," Emily said firmly. "She is a necessary part of his recovery, and when she was taken from him, it was the same as taking a wheelchair from someone who couldn't walk." The courtroom was silent. Ethan kept his eyes down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Emily then introduced a short video taken during the supervised visit the day before. The judge nodded in approval, and the small monitor was turned so he could watch. The footage showed Bailey running into Ethan's arms. It showed her crying, clinging, and Ethan kneeling on the ground, whispering into her fur. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. It was raw, real, unforgettable. When the video ended, the judge leaned back. For a moment, he said nothing. Then a voice from the back of the courtroom surprised everyone. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Heads turned. A middle-aged man in a blazer stepped forward. He introduced himself as Dr. Hellstrom, a retired military psychologist who had worked with hundreds of veterans suffering from PTSD. "I didn't plan to speak today," he said, "but I've worked with people like Mr. Cole. I've seen how losing a support animal can undo years of progress. That dog isn't just helping him, she's saving him." The judge listened closely. So did the entire courtroom. Dr. Hellstrom continued. "What happened at the store wasn't violence. It was a moment of panic, triggered by trauma. If anything, the fact that he didn't lash out is proof that he's working hard to stay in control. And Bailey is his anchor." The judge nodded slowly, then turned back to Emily. "Anything else, counselor?" She stepped aside. "No further remarks, Your Honor. The truth spoke for itself yesterday." Ethan looked up now, quietly, eyes tired, but resolute. The judge cleared his throat. "Very well. I will take all this into consideration before rendering a final ruling. In the meantime, the court is placing Bailey under temporary custody with Mr. Cole, pending regular wellness checks by animal services and therapy sessions provided by a certified program." A wave of emotion rippled through the room. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. He turned to Emily, who smiled through teary eyes. "You're going home with her," she whispered. The gavel came down gently. Court was dismissed. But Ethan's fight had just taken a beautiful, unexpected turn. The courthouse doors opened, and Ethan stepped outside with Bailey trotting beside him, her leash held gently in his hand. For a moment, everything around him seemed to slow. Reporters lined the walkway, snapping photos and whispering among themselves. Spectators clapped softly, but Ethan didn't notice any of it. He was too focused on the golden bundle of fur. Walking beside him, tail swishing with pride, Bailey looked up at him and gave a soft bark, like she knew everything had changed. Emily caught up to him near the sidewalk. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Better than I've been in months." They reached his truck, a weathered old pickup he hadn't used in weeks. Bailey jumped in before he even opened the door all the way. She curled up on the passenger seat like she'd never left it. On the drive home, Ethan didn't say much, but every few minutes, he'd reach over and rest his hand on Bailey's back. She'd lift her head, give his fingers a gentle lick, then sigh and lay back down. It wasn't just a pet riding in the front seat. It was a wounded soul rediscovering peace. Back at the apartment, the moment they stepped inside, Bailey ran to her corner. Her old bed was still there, her toys scattered. Just as she left them, she sniffed each one carefully, then turned and wagged her tail. Eyes glowing. Ethan dropped to the floor and sat beside her, overwhelmed by the feeling of home. That night, for the first time in weeks, he slept soundly. No nightmares, no jolting. Awake, Bailey stayed pressed against his side the entire night. She didn't even stir when thunder rolled through the early morning sky. The next few days brought a calm Ethan hadn't known in years. Bailey followed him everywhere, to the mailbox, to the corner store, even into therapy. People in town began to recognize them again. A few approached him in quiet admiration. "Hey, I saw you on the news," one man said outside the grocery store. "I didn't know your story, but I'm glad you got her back." Others simply nodded in respect. No one looked at him with fear anymore. Now, they saw something else. A soldier, a survivor, a man trying to rebuild. But not everything was easy. Every Tuesday, a representative from Animal Services came to check on Bailey's well-being. Ethan welcomed them without complaint. He had nothing to hide. Bailey was always clean, fed, and energetic. The officials quickly saw she was thriving. Meanwhile, Ethan started regular sessions with a trauma counselor, something he had avoided for years. Bailey would sit at his feet. While he opened up about the past, he talked about the things he saw, the brothers he lost, and the weight he carried every day. And through it all, Bailey stayed by his side. One morning, Emily called with news. "Ethan, I think you should know, your story is spreading. It's gone national. I've had calls from veteran groups, non-profit organizations, even journalists. People are moved." He was quiet for a moment, processing. "I didn't ask for attention," he said softly. "I know," Emily replied, "but maybe the right kind of attention can help more people like you." That afternoon, Ethan received a letter in the mail. It was handwritten, the envelope creased and slightly torn. Inside was a note from a fellow veteran who had also struggled with PTSD. "I thought about ending it last week," the letter read. "Then I saw your story. You reminded me that maybe there's still good left. Thank you for not giving up." Ethan sat on the porch, holding the letter in one hand and petting Bailey with the other. For the first time in a long time, he realized something powerful. Maybe what had happened in that courtroom wasn't just about him and Bailey. Maybe it was about hope. The letter Ethan received stayed on his nightstand. Every morning, he read it again, not because he needed the praise, but because it reminded him that his pain had meaning, that his survival was helping someone else survive too. He had always believed his story didn't matter. Now, he wasn't so sure. More letters followed. Messages from strangers, comments online. People shared stories about their own battles, anxiety, grief, trauma, loneliness, and over they mentioned, "Bailey, I cried when I saw her run to you. I have a service dog too. You helped me feel less alone. Thank you for reminding the world that veterans are human beings, not just uniforms." Ethan never asked for the spotlight, but it found him. And slowly, he realized he had a voice. A quiet one, but a voice nonetheless. A week after the courtroom reunion, a woman named Lena Watkins asked to meet him. She was the director of a nonprofit that supported veterans with PTSD. She had watched the video of Ethan and Bailey's reunion and knew. Immediately she had to reach out. They met at a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town. Bailey sat beneath the table, calm as ever. "Ethan," Lena began, "I don't want to just thank you. I want to offer you something." He raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Our organization has funding for a new program, something small to start. A recovery support group for veterans transitioning back into civilian life. I want you to help lead it." Ethan shook his head quickly. "I'm not qualified." Lena smiled gently. "You're exactly qualified. You're living it, and people listen to you, whether you realize it or not." He looked down at Bailey. She tilted her head, as if waiting for his answer to, "I'll think about it," he said softly. Later that evening, Ethan stood at the window in his apartment, arms crossed, watching the rain roll down the glass. Bailey rested nearby, her breathing slow and steady. He wasn't used to being needed. For years he had felt like a burden someone others had to take care of. But now, things were shifting. He thought about Lena's offer, about the letters, about the quiet applause in the courtroom, and deep inside, a small part of him whispered, "You have something to give." The next day, he called Lena. "I'll do it," he said. She didn't hesitate. "Then let's begin." Over the next few weeks, Ethan helped organize the first small meeting at a local community center. Only 6 veterans came the first time. Most didn't talk. Some barely made eye contact. But Ethan understood that silence. It wasn't resistance, it was fear. The fear of being seen. He didn't lecture, he didn't preach. He just told his story. He told them about the day he froze in the store aisle, the cold holding cell, the silence in his apartment, and the courtroom moment that changed everything. And then he talked about Bailey. When he finished, one of the veterans, a quiet man with a limp and deep-set eyes, raised his hand. "How did you get the courage to ask for help?" he asked. Ethan thought for a moment, then looked down at Bailey. "I didn't," he said. "But she did. She made me feel like I was worth helping." From that day on, the meetings grew. More veterans came. Some brought their dogs. Some brought only pain. But they all brought hope, the kind that begins when one person stands up and says, "Me too." The shift was no longer just inside. Ethan, it was spreading. He wasn't just rebuilding his life. He was helping others find their way back to theirs. By mid-spring, Ethan's support group had grown into something far greater than he ever imagined. Veterans who once sat in silence were now speaking freely. Laughter echoed in the room some evenings. Hugs were exchanged. Even those who didn't talk found comfort simply being there. The group didn't just help them, it gave them a reason to keep showing up. Ethan arrived early each week, setting up chairs and making sure there was fresh coffee. Bailey had her spot beside the door, where she greeted every person with a wag of her tail and a gentle nudge. To many, she was more than a dog. She was a symbol of second chances, of quiet strength, of healing. One rainy Thursday, Lena arrived at the center with a look in her eyes Ethan hadn't seen before. She pulled him aside as the others filtered in. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said. A tall woman stepped into the hallway, dressed in a navy blue coat and holding a folder. She introduced herself as Maya Reynolds, a program director from the National Veterans Advocacy Council. "I've been following your journey since the court story made national news," she said. "We've been watching what you've built. Here, the growth, the impact." Ethan blinked, unsure what to say. Maya continued, "We have a proposal. Our organization has been developing a national outreach initiative, one that connects veterans with peer-led support centers across the country. We'd like to expand your model. Not only that, we want you to help lead the project." Ethan stared at her, stunned. "You want me?" he asked. Maya smiled. "Yes, we want you to be part of something bigger. You've lived it. You've proven that healing doesn't have to come from a textbook. Sometimes it comes from real connection, from truth, from people like you." The offer was overwhelming. A few months ago, Ethan had been sitting in a jail cell, heartbroken and alone. Now, he was being asked to help shape a national program. He didn't know how to respond. "Think about it," Maya said kindly. "There's no pressure. We just wanted to extend the invitation." After she left, Ethan sat outside in the rain with Bailey lying at his feet. He stared out at the trees, water dripping from the leaves, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't used to being asked to lead anything. In the military, he followed orders. After returning, he'd felt invisible. He never imagined someone would look at him and see potential again. But maybe it was time to stop living like he didn't deserve to be heard. Later that night, he stood in front of the support group. After they settled in, he cleared his throat. "I want to share something," he said, voice steady. "I was offered a position to help create support centers like this one, all across the country. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because I wouldn't be here if it weren't for all of you." He looked around the room, faces full of quiet encouragement. Bailey wagged her tail at his feet. "I'm going to accept," he said. A small cheer went up. A few clapped. One veteran smiled and said, "About time someone like you got the chance to make the rules." That night, Ethan walked home with Bailey trotting beside him, the streetlights casting a soft glow ahead. He thought about where he had started, the arrest, the courtroom, the goodbye he thought would be his last. But life, it seemed, wasn't done surprising him. He hadn't just gotten Bailey back, he had found his purpose. 3 months after accepting the offer, Ethan stood in a room he never thought he'd be in, the central headquarters of the National Veterans Advocacy Council. Behind him, Bailey sat proudly with her service vest on, a symbol not just of loyalty, but of everything they had overcome together. The project had been approved. Ethan was now officially leading the launch of Operation Homefront Voice, a program designed to establish veteran-led support circles in towns across the country. It was modeled after the very group he had built from nothing, just a circle of chairs, a pot of coffee, and the courage to speak. He wasn't alone anymore. A team of coordinators, therapists, and fellow veterans worked alongside him. But even in meetings filled with strategy and planning, Ethan never lost sight of what it was really about. People, the broken ones, the silent ones, the ones who, like him, had once thought about giving up. Back in his hometown, things had changed too. The community center where his support group first met was now being remodeled and expanded. Donations had poured in from across the country after his story aired on a national television segment. Volunteers helped paint, install lights, and build a new wing that would serve as a permanent resource space for veterans and their families. One morning, a woman arrived at the center holding a leash. Her eyes were tired, and her posture was guarded, but she was there. "This is Tank," she said softly. "He was my late husband's dog. He served 2 tours. Ethan knelt and let Tank sniff his hand. The dog nudged forward and licked his fingers. "You're welcome here," Ethan told her, "both of you." It wasn't just a moment, it was a beginning. As the weeks passed, Bailey became a familiar face on posters and flyers for the national program. Her photo, that of a golden retriever resting her head on Ethan's knee, became a quiet reminder of healing and companionship. People connected with it. They didn't just see a dog. They saw hope. Letters continued to arrive. Not just from veterans, but from families, teachers, and teenagers who had faced their own struggles. One letter came from a 16-year-old boy in Kansas who had lost his father to suicide. "I never talked to anyone about how I felt," it read. "But then I saw your story. I showed my mom, we cried. I asked her if we could go to one of those groups." Ethan read it twice. Sometimes, the letters brought tears. Other times, they gave him strength. But every one reminded him of why he kept showing up. He also began speaking at conferences in schools. Not as an expert, but as someone who had lived through the silence and came out the other side. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just told the truth about pain, about resilience, and about Bailey. During one speaking event, a young boy in the audience raised his hand and asked, "Is Bailey a hero?" Ethan looked down at her, smiling. "She's more than a hero," he said. "She's my best friend." That night, he and Bailey walked through a quiet park under a sky full of stars. She trotted ahead, ears perked, stopping every now and then. To make sure he was still following, he paused, looking up at the stars. "I never thought I'd make it this far," he said aloud. Bailey turned back. Wagging her tail, Ethan smiled. And in that quiet moment, under that vast sky, he understood something he never had before. Healing didn't come all at once. It came slowly, sometimes in the form of a paw, a letter, or a voice in the dark saying, "You're not alone." A year had passed since the courtroom moment that changed Ethan's life. 12 months since he stood before a judge with trembling hands and asked for one final goodbye to his dog. What began as a desperate request had grown into something no one could have imagined. Now, Ethan found himself back in that same courthouse. But this time he wasn't sitting at the defense table. He wasn't pleading or waiting or hoping. He was standing behind the podium as a guest speaker at a special event titled Honor, Healing, and Homecoming. Organized by the state to recognize veterans and mental health advocates, the event was being held in the very courtroom where Ethan's story had first unfolded. The room was full. City officials, veterans, families, reporters, and community leaders had gathered to hear him speak. Lena was there. So was Maya from the National Council. Emily sat in the front row, proud as ever. And beside Ethan, lying calmly on the floor, was Bailey, older now, a little grayer around the muzzle, but still alert, still loyal. Ethan looked out across the room. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "I came into this building once with nothing but fear," he said. "I thought I was about to lose the one thing that gave me peace. I didn't think I mattered. I didn't think anyone would care about a veteran like me." He paused, eyes settling on Bailey. "But something happened here that day, something I still can't fully explain. A moment of compassion, a shift in the room. It reminded me that healing doesn't happen in silence. It happens when someone listens. When someone says yes, when they could have said no." The room was quiet, everyone leaning in. "I asked for one last goodbye," Ethan continued. "But what I got was a new beginning." When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Some stood, others wiped their eyes. Even the judge who had presided over Ethan's case all those months ago was present, seated in the same chair. He stood up and approached the podium. "I don't usually get to see what happens after the verdict," the judge said. "But today, I got to witness something rare. A full circle moment. Mr. Cole, your story didn't just change lives. It changed how we think about service, healing, and justice." Then, to everyone's surprise, the judge reached beneath the bench and held out a framed certificate. "This is a full dismissal of all previous charges. Not just because of what you've overcome, but because of what you've done with it." Ethan took the certificate, stunned. The courtroom stood. Once again, this time in a standing ovation. But the surprises weren't over. Maya stepped forward next. She held a small box and handed it to Ethan. Inside was a custom-made medallion engraved with two simple words, "Still standing." "This medallion is the first of many," she announced. "They will be given to veterans across the country who, like Ethan, show others that healing is possible." Ethan looked down at the medal, eyes brimming with quiet gratitude. He turned to Bailey, who lifted her head as if she understood everything. Later that evening, Ethan and Bailey walked through the town square, where a small mural had just been unveiled. It was a painting of a soldier kneeling with his arms around a golden retriever, a tribute not just to them, but to every unseen battle being fought in silence. People paused to admire it. Some took photos, others just stood in quiet reflection. As Ethan looked up at the mural, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not just for himself, but for every soul who had once believed they were forgotten. He placed a hand on Bailey's head. "We did it, girl," he whispered, and Bailey, faithful as ever, wagged her tail in reply.